Okay. So this is the title of the paper on purpose, and it's a theory on the fundamental life drive involvement in psychology. And it's a fairly brief paper as papers go, and it examines two concepts. And the first is how the fundamental survival process that has supported all sentient life on Earth for many, many years might be responsible for many, or maybe even all, of the psychological health issues in our modern world. The second shows the conclusions seem to underpin the BWRT process and might even prepare the way for a unified style of therapy, effectively the psychological equivalent of the theory of everything sought for many years by a physicist. I'm on the way to that, by the way, to a unified therapy. I haven't got it yet, but I'm on the way to it. There's no claim this paper is the result of rigorous research and trials, although it does reference several, more that it represents a sometimes contentious theory that might be worthy of further investigation. And the research was conducted solely via the internet, and all references are internet links. Now, the introduction to it will be very familiar to you because it's talking about brain biology and evolution. It had to be covered, otherwise the paper will be incomplete. So, although there are things in here that you may not remember or may not encounter before. So, the introduction to it all is that there are many different expositions of the development of the human brain, frequently contradictory in what's claimed. This is of no great importance here because the particular stages of brain evolution are of less interest to psychology than the understanding of how they arose, what they do, and why. And the human brain, in all its apparent complexity, has its origins in the relatively basic organ of our most ancient ancestors. One school of thought states the early animals were those related to sponges that appeared around 800 million years ago. They were mainly just floating organisms like comb jelly, though, and the earliest sentient beings that might be recognizable as true animals with a genuine brain structure appear to have come into being about 575 million years ago. And these later creatures had a proto-brain. I'll show you a picture of one later, a proto-brain that comprised the brainstem and cerebellum, and the whole of which is sometimes referred to as the lizard brain, although it predated lizards, reptilian brain, or sometimes reptilian complex, because it was and still is two brain regions working as one. So it's not just a single brain region. It was responsible for every element of survival, including three of the four fundamental processes of life: hunting, feeding, and sleeping. And I haven't missed one out, in case you think I have. As well as essential bodily maintenance processes such as proto-respiration, because these were ocean dwellers, circulation, excretion, and immune function. Also dealt with the responses to occasional threats from predators or naturally occurring events such as flood, fire, and quake. There was no planning ability, nothing that we would recognize today as intelligent awareness. It was a biological robot pre-programmed with instincts of self-preservation which were present at birth. The fourth fundamental process, breeding via sexual coupling, evolved around the same time as the early tetrapods, four-legged creatures, began to walk on land some 397 million years ago. And so hunting was no longer just for food, but also for the opportunity to breed. Functionally, though, that would have been, and still most often is, the conscious pursuit of sexual gratification, the reward for the pursuit, rather than nature's intent on the production of progeny. It was almost another 200 million years before the first tiny mammals appeared, little shrew-like creatures they were. Still far removed from the Homo genus, they were nonetheless highly evolved compared to their ocean-living forebears, having a mammalian brain and a limbic system with a small neocortex. And it's uncertain where and how this leap of evolution occurred. Nobody's been able to track that down as far as I could find out. But at this stage, there was almost certainly no awareness of self. And they were still maintaining biological machines, self-maintaining biological machines who would hunt, eat, sleep, breed, and attack or defend when necessary. They were building on the evolutionary development of almost 400 million years that had proved the effectiveness of the survival instincts inherited from the earliest creatures. And for nearly 200 million years more, nothing changed. Hunt, eat, sleep, breed when possible, attack, defend, or escape when necessary, proved to be a viable model for survival. Those are our ancestors. That's where we descended from. That's what our brain still does. It was close to 6 million years ago that the first mammals recognizable as being our direct human ancestors appeared, almost certainly creatures with the dawning of the earliest forms of self-awareness. The brain was still evolving, though, and not until around 300,000 years ago did it evolve to the form we know today. It's an interesting circumstance that even today, with our increasingly sophisticated exploratory tools, nobody has yet been able to say for certain exactly where the phenomenon we'll call consciousness or awareness is located, when it might have evolved, or even what it is. So the foregoing, with references to supporting science, describes the outline of the complexity of the evolutionary process that have resulted in the present-day human. From here on, this paper explores a theoretical concept which there is rather less supporting evidence. There are two important precepts to the theory being presented here. One is that the fundamental process can be consciously controlled, at least to an extent. All fundamental processes can be consciously controlled, at least to an extent, though there is a price to pay in anxiety as a result of an undischarged survival instinct. The second point is that nature doesn't replace a perfectly functioning system with a new model as a result of evolution, though it sometimes modifies it. In the case of the human animal, this was to increase the size of the cerebellum to become proportionally larger in relation to overall brain size than that of any animal on Earth. So while our survival instincts are based on the lives and deaths of millions of generations before us, those instinctive responses are still driven by an instrument that has changed not at all since those days of total non-awareness. It remains today the first responder to stimuli from the world, just as it always has been, and it still constantly scans their environment for threat, just as it always has done. The response was always likely to have been a simple tripartite system because not only was it all that was necessary, it was also fast and effective, exactly what was needed for survival. So the three parts, the tripartite system: the environment is safe, carry on. The environment is unsafe, feel, fear, and act. The environment is unrecognized, be cautious. And by environment, I mean what's going on, obviously, in the environment as well. That same reptilian complex must now contend with the far more complex processes of conscious experience, and it can't respond to it in any other way than it has always responded. It's safe, unsafe, or uncertain. And this is where problems begin to arise, because the result of that response only arrives in consciousness around half a second after it's been initiated because of the transit time from the reptilian complex to the frontal lobes, where it's assumed that consciousness is present via the limbic system. So we can never prevent, modify, or filter the initialization in the first place. And this is where some uncomfortable processes start to take place. I'm going to be covering it in some detail in the rest of the paper, but here's a small teaser example. An individual believes they don't look as attractive as their peers. This is, to them, a vital aspect of their existence, so they know they're inferior and react with despair. The reptilian complex can only perceive the situation as unsafe, feel fear, and act. The result being anxiety, and when that fails to result in resolution of the situation, it's eventually followed by its natural progression, depression. And as for what depression is all about, that is possibly to stop all activity, conserving resources in order to survive for longer. You could wonder how suicide as a result of depression could be involved with survival, but it's probably an example of an unintended consequence, because the early creatures who experienced depression would become less active and reactive, and therefore would survive for as long as was possible because they couldn't kill themselves. Good. Okay, so this is headed the life force. And from this point on, this paper is based on the premise that the underlying purpose of all sentient life is solely survival of self and the species. Morals, politics, gender equality, material wealth, life partners, social class or standing, intelligence, education, prison, law, science, psychology, none of those count for anything at all. It's all about survival and nothing else. This worked perfectly well for all life forms, from the earliest known creature, an ocean bed dweller called Dickinsonia. I've got a picture of Dickinsonia. As you can see, it looks a little bit like a trilobite, I've actually got to try to buy some soft fossil somewhere. And nobody's absolutely sure whether that was an early animal or whether it was still plant-based. The belief is that it was an early animal.
that's
So I'll start that again. This worked perfectly well for all life forms, from the earliest known creature, an ocean bed dweller called Dickinsonia, up until sometime after the modern human appeared. This animal had awareness not just of its surroundings and whether they were safe or otherwise, but awareness of self. All of a sudden, things start to get difficult because they had intelligence, the theory of mind, the capability of assessing what others were thinking, even if the assessment was wrong, and the ability to compare self with others. It's almost certainly because of the advent of that theory of mind, along with social interaction, that a fifth fundamental driver evolved, which, while it's not necessary for survival, is powerful enough to create much anxiety and has been responsible for many deaths. And that fundamental is threat to integrity and the three conscious reactions of guilt, shame, and shame's lesser cousin, embarrassment. Though it's probable the reptilian complex interprets it as a threat to survival, I'm convinced that's what this theory is about, that we're still driven by that extremely basic process. These creatures, these new humans, were aggressive, territorial, creative, and able to fashion tools that allowed more control of their environment and others. They started to become motivated by their emotional responses to the environment, and it was no longer sufficient just to survive from one end of the day to the other. They were intelligent, and intelligence demands stimulation, so that when there was no threat, what had once been "the environment is safe, carry on" became "the environment is boring, do something," as a conscious process. The purpose of life, survival, was soon submerged beneath the wants and wishes of the conscious mind, and before long, many began to seek power, riches, control, superiority, possessions, and status, but they were still driven by that primitive reptilian complex with its tripartite control system. Now, it's important that the cerebellum has 80% of the brain's entire processing power, allowing it to recognize trillions of different combinations of inputs, both from the environment and the feedback from conscious processes. But it can still only respond with safe, unsafe, and caution, because it existed like that for millions upon millions upon millions of years. And it's only 6 million years ago where creatures where that was slightly different began to arrive. And it's only really the last 300,000 years where we've had a great deal of awareness and the theory of mind and the brain as it is now. So that we're still working on that ancient reptilian complex. So fast forward now to the present day. The fundamental drives are still the same, still vital to the purpose of life, and all distinct from each other as far as what the physical body is doing. Sleeping hasn't changed much, though feeding has become considerably simpler than the foraging and prey stalking of our ancestors. The other two, the hunt and the breed when possible drives, have become the source of much modern distress, especially when combined as they so often are. And we'll explore the reasons for this in some detail in the rest of this paper, looking at each separately and also when in combination with each other. So, process, breed when possible. Because this is fundamental to the survival of life itself, it can wield immense power in both psychology and physiology, second only to that in response to the threat of imminent death. The desire for sexual activity is present in all animals and in both genders, but the human animal alone has sought to control it with taboos and moral codes, which themselves are consciously protected by the fifth fundamental drive, the maintenance of personal integrity. Sexual desire is an involuntary process, and when it arises in relation to an individual or concept that is out of bounds for one reason or another, including rape and abuse, the resultant conflict between desire and the threat to personal integrity can be profound. This is because for a pack animal such as the human, the resultant contempt or dismissal from the loss of integrity might be viewed as a threat to survival in its current form, effectively a threat to the end of life as it's known at that point. It's from this point onwards where it starts to get a bit uncomfortable if you're sensitive to such things, and gets very uncomfortable at some point. So do a little bit of a hint ahead. When a fundamental instinct from the reptilian complex is not discharged in whatever mode of action it is evolved to instigate, it will begin to increase the intensity level of the arousal state, sexual arousal being particularly insistent. Permitted sexual activity with somebody else or masturbation where that's not against religion will assuage the need, at least temporarily. But where that's not possible and where the instinct is not discharged, the result will be anxiety, since part of the purpose of life, survival of the species in this instance, has been denied. Problems don't arise only in the case of forbidden sexual activity, of course, but also in the far simpler situation of a legitimate sexual partner, legitimate is in quotes, continually rejecting the advances of the other for whatever reason. In this case, the rejected individual will suffer anxiety as a result of the unfulfilled opportunity for breeding, whether that was the intention or not, and the one who is rejecting will suffer anxiety as a result of failing to respond, though the level will depend on many diverse factors, including whether or not they were experiencing their own arousal. Now, some might say there's a case to be made here for Sigmund Freud's assertion that if the sex life is as we wish it to be, there will be no neurosis. It's an unpopular concept, but nonetheless, there is some case to be made for it. By extrapolation, that might mean that whenever the sex life as an individual is not as they wish it to be, there will be neurosis, and that might actually be the case were it not for the fact that the reptilian complex has a trick or two in reserve. It can learn a replacement response to patterns of behavior, and continued conscious denial of the urge for sexual activity will eventually be absorbed as a new and valid response to the urge, though the stronger the urge initially, the longer and more complete the denial must be. Eventually it ceases to arise at all, though in some circumstances might be sublimated to religion or some other concept concerning control, restriction, or denial, reflecting the distortion that has been applied. The reptilian complex, though, responds fully only to complete matches. It won't respond partially, it responds fully only to complete matches. And this can create a rather odd situation where an individual who has denied what we can refer to as normal sexual activity over and again for one reason or another suddenly encounters a stimulus to which they've had no previous exposure or awareness and is instantly and profoundly aroused. For the purposes of this paper, the reasons behind such a situation are irrelevant. Suffice to say, the awakening might be concerned with fetish, gender sexuality, or other non-standard sexual stimulus. And it's important to remember that such awakening is not a matter of choice. The reasons for the original denial can be many and varied, but this paper is not about that. It's only exploring the eventual effects of this sudden awakening, the response to which might well be a threat to integrity and resultant anxiety. Sometimes even gives rise to the paradoxical situation where an individual takes their own life as a result of responding to the fundamental urge responsible for the actual creation of life. Although it's often the case, that response is distorted and could not actually have resulted in conception. For the sake of clarity, what I'm talking about here doesn't refer to any specific gender, but to all humans. The anxiety created by the type of circumstance explored here will sometimes be simply endured, the individual not even realizing why they're experiencing it. At other times, it might be assuaged by becoming obsessively involved in some other activity as a replacement, often creatively inspired. A third possibility is therapy or the use of a sedating process such as medication, alcohol, or narcotics. And as will be shown later, the understanding gained from this paper may be able to enhance any therapeutic intervention. One other situation that we should explore here, albeit briefly, is that of voluntary celibacy. And those who practice this often refer to themselves as volcels. Okay, put that on the screen. Volcels. It's often not total abstinence, just of penetrative sexual intercourse. And there might be frequent sexual activity, including masturbation and so-called outercourse, which for some, as you can see on the screen, is everything except penis and vagina penetration. For others, outercourse means no penetration of any kind, including fingers, sex toys, and anal sex. So this being the case, it's quite likely that there's little or no sexually based anxiety within the state of voluntary celibacy. Involuntary celibacy, however, is a completely different thing altogether, and we'll be examining that in the next section, Hunting to Breed. sorry, hunting to breed. We're getting some dark stuff here. Maybe many animals, maybe all animals, seek sexual pleasure. But for the human, the hunt for a sexual partner can be fraught with difficulties. Not so long ago, it'd be centered on the workplace and social gatherings, perhaps also the occasional blind date, and therefore usually restricted to the immediate locality. This meant numbers of partners are limited, and so there was a tendency to be reasonably tolerant of the personal foibles of a partner as long as there was some pleasure in their company. Few people expected to discover the impossible ideal of perfection, and there was a general acceptance that the world's beautiful people were either royalty or otherwise beyond the sphere of the common populace. Any of you that are as old as me, or maybe a bit not as old as me, can remember a time when it was just like that. You found your partners from the workplace or people you met in a coffee bar or whatever. The hunt was a relatively genteel affair, conducted with the hope that the one would suddenly be encountered in the way of storylines in the fiction of the day, at a dance, the local library, the new person at work, or perhaps the person who served one in a coffee bar. But now, things are very different for quite a large proportion of those seeking a sexual partner. For those, with the swipe of a finger on an illuminated screen, it's possible to accept or reject the attentions of an unknown individual who may or may not be who or what the text states. But there's a vital element missing in that electronic encounter, one that's based upon those millions of years of evolution: olfaction, body scent. There can be nobody who has not met somebody they thought extremely sexy but didn't really know why. And equally, there can be nobody who hasn't met somebody who looks this way, they ought to be sexy, but nothing stirs. The answer is probably in our reaction to the individual's body scent, which will prevail even through a liberal dousing of perfume or cologne. And when we're unable to employ one or more of our senses for a task, more focus is given to any other relevant senses, and in this case, it's sight. The focus on the visual sense carries far more of a problem that might at first be realized. This recognition of being assessed for sexual attractiveness on physical appearance alone at first led only to an individual perhaps having a professional photographic session or just taking numerous self-portraits in numerous different poses so they could select what they considered to be their best side. But then some started using filters and specialized editing to enhance their image, and quite suddenly everybody began to believe they must look as though they'd been sculpted to perfection. Instead of seeking somebody with whom there's a mutual attraction, they instead seek better software and better editing skills. They're focused on them and how others will see them. And when they feel they aren't at the top of when they feel they aren't at the top, become increasingly anxious that not only are they not winning the competition, but they may not also even be able to compete as well as the others. On social media, insufficient likes along with negative comments can be enough to convince the individual that they're such an inferior being as to be of no value to the species, since they will not be able to breed. This is not a conscious assessment, of course, because the conscious focus is on the more obvious and immediate situation of others don't see me as likely to attract a mate. This feeds back to the reptilian complex as I am unable to fulfill the purpose of life, which will respond by triggering anxiety because of the threat to survival of the species. I said earlier that would end up with depression, and I'll talk again about that later in more detail. It's worth noting that the lack of likes, along with the negative comments from others, are themselves likely to be the product of the same fear of not being able to win the competition for breeding. It's as if in that environment, all contenders are competing for a single available, though unspecified mate. Thought experiments suggest that if the number of potential mates was equal to those doing the searching, meaning that everybody would get somebody, the anxiety levels would be considerably reduced, though not removed completely. Now, it's worth the reiteration here that an individual's conscious processes would be focused only on the psychologically obvious recognition of, I don't look as good as the others. When this belief of unworthiness and unattractiveness is confirmed by constant rejection from others, either physically or via the left swipe on the various find a mate internet sites, the eventual outcome is often an unwilling recognition of being an incel. Here we are, incel. One who is involuntarily celibate. The media focus is often only on males, but the situation exists also for many females who suffer the same level of distress. But this is where the difference in evolutionary biology for males and females takes a firm hold on the psyche. Females appear more likely to be accepting of the situation, perhaps because they were the more passive in the search of sexual activity, since it usually came to them without the need for their participation. We're talking about the ancient ancestors, of course, here. Also, since they could conceive only roughly once a year, there was less urgency to couple. Female sexual arousal was never as instantaneous as that of the male, but the male has always been the sexual hunter, has always had the more immediate urgency of sex drive, is evolutionarily designed as a prolific biological insemination machine, and has always been more prone to anger when refused sex for any reason. Therefore, it should not be a surprise that the male incel is more likely to turn to completely unacceptable behavior or violence, but it won't necessarily do so, but more likely to do so as a result of the thwarted opportunity for sex than is the female. Now, this is where I've got here contention alert. Please suspend any outrage until you've read this entire passage, okay? Because it's important, because you need a cool mind and your therapist clinical self to assess what I'm saying here before you start bristling. Males and females are likely to find themselves irritated unless I've done a really good job on presentation to begin with. You'll get a chance to talk about this in a minute. There's no attempt here to justify or excuse such male attitudes to sexuality, but merely to explain what the underlying mechanism might be. The male incel is obviously not focused on, I need to breed, otherwise I'm not fulfilling the purpose of life, but on, I want sex. They're not thinking of the future of the species, but are focused on the relentless drive for sexual pleasure that nature involved to ensure life. In extreme cases, they might turn to coercion, rape, manipulation, imprisonment, or even to a killing spree. To begin to understand the process, it's necessary to clinically consider the origins and biochemistry of arousal. There are three important factors. The sex drive is fundamental to all life, and in the absence of defect, is immensely powerful and present in all humans. The second point is it's not possible for the human male or female to prevent any feeling or response occurring, but it's usually possible to control how they behave as a result of that feeling or response. And the third is the immediacy and intensity of the male sexual response is that in a minority of individuals, it can temporarily override social and moral codes and even anxiety about punishment. In these individuals, which are thankfully a small percentage of males, they've reverted to the behavior of our ancient ancestors in seeking sexual gratification whenever and wherever possible. Now, in the parts of the world where it's intended that all individuals should be subject to the same rules and protected by the same safeguarding principles, the greater majority of males have acquired an auto-inhibitory response. Put simply, when they want to, but the focus of their sexual attention is out of bounds, they know they can't. Arousal, if it occurs at all, is minimal or purely a psychological awareness, and they don't pursue it any further. They might talk to their friends about it, but they don't pursue it any further. It's not clear under which circumstances this inhibition fails to develop, or even if it's a conscious or reptilian complex response, but it's likely to be as a result of abnormal psychology. In other words, they are possibly unwell or have developmental issues. And here's an interesting thought for you. It's even possible that there's some epigenetic inheritance of trauma triggering a retaliatory response against their sexual prey. There's a lot in that sentence to think about. It's even possible there's some epigenetic inheritance of trauma. We know that happens, triggering a retaliatory response against their sexual prey. None of this is to excuse their behavior because it's completely voluntary and self-centered, but it's just a theory of the possible mechanism behind it. Now, at this point, whatever the response you're feeling to the foregoing, you're experiencing the truth of the concept that the human animal can't control what they feel, only how they respond to what they feel. And this, of course, is exactly what all psychology-based therapists are working with. That's hunting the modern way. For our ancestors, as far back as sentient life has existed, the purpose of life was to maintain life itself, and hunting for sustenance was an essential part of that process. The creatures that experience the highest degrees of wanting would be driven by the earliest forms of motivation and resolve, and therefore more likely to survive than those who relinquish the hunt sooner. The reptilian complex can only take account of those four basic fundamental drives. That's all it can do even now. It can't take account of anything else. It doesn't know anything else. It can still only take account of those four fundamental basic drives: hunting, breeding, eating, and sleeping. Those are the four fundamental drives. The fifth one isn't really reptilian, the threat to integrity. It's more of a conscious one, but it's very strong. So for many millions of years, those four were the only possible activities and all quite distinct from each other. So if none of those were active, the environment was neutral and therefore safe. And it's even probable that a similar situation exists today. If you're not sleeping, hunting, eating, or breeding, the environment is neutral. I know you want to sort of pick holes in that, and you probably could, but nonetheless, that's the basic idea of the way your reptilian complex works. With feedback from the physical body to the reptilian complex that hunting is taking place, is wanting and searching. That's the feedback from the physical body to the reptilian complex that hunting is taking place, wanting and searching. The more intense each of those are, the more anxiety is generated by their absence. And since the hunt was only ever for sustenance, the anxiety fueled the urge to fulfill the purpose of life, survival. But the modern human in the civilized world has an uncomfortable combination of conscious awareness and intellect, and lives in a sophisticated environment where possessions are prized as highly as sustenance originally was. So, the hunt process is sometimes far removed from that which existed for millions of years, and still does exist for all wild animals. Now, these are bullet points. The modern human's hunt is no longer only for sustenance to survive, but also for any desirable acquisitions. The modern version of the scent of a prey, or the lure that some animals employ, is seductive advertising, and we're predisposed to respond to desirable prey. The importance attached to acquisitions provides feedback to the reptilian complex that the hunt is on for something that is essential for survival, just because we attach such importance to it. The initial hunt is for the money to exchange for such important prey. If the hunt fails to produce enough money to acquire the prey, it means the hunting skills are insufficient. The reptilian complex receives the feedback that the hunting skills are insufficient, which means survival is threatened, generating anxiety to intensify the hunt, which may be experienced as frustration or despair. And when the anxiety fails to produce the intended outcome, the reptilian complex eventually ceases to provide stimulus since there's no useful response. And the lack of stimulus is experienced as depression. This is not to say that not being able to have the latest mobile phone, television, or glamorous motor vehicle is necessarily the cause of depression, but the perception that others are more successful hunters might be. And this is because throughout the aeons when the hunt was solely for sustenance, the less successful the hunter, the lower the chances of survival. And this might subsequently result in a subconscious recognition or perception that the more successful hunters are acquiring so much of a limited commodity, which might have been the case with food originally, as to further reduce their own chances of success and subsequent survival. The anxiety, depression, and therapy. It's essential to understand the reptilian complex has no conception of the fine details of events, but simply recognizes patterns that have previously been experienced. You all know that already, of course. When an apparent threat is encountered, it triggers a response intended to ensure survival as long as possible. Otherwise, does nothing other than continue to monitor the environment. So, if we accept the premise that the only true purpose of life is survival, it's fair to suppose that all anxiety is related to a perception that life itself is threatened. This is not a new idea by any means. I only found one reference to it, which is there's a link to it later when you get the notes. It's not a new idea, but doesn't appear to be a widespread theory. But for the purpose of this paper, it'll be assumed to be well-founded. But what's not so evident is why anxiety can lead to depression, and why depression would ever have evolved in the first place. This has been touched upon earlier. but I'm going to expand upon it here. Anxiety is a response to all threat and has possibly evolved to stimulate action. For without action, we can't resolve a threat. Most people have experienced a situation where it's difficult to sit or stand still in the face of anxiety. And the greater the anxiety, the greater the sense of agitation. And this makes sense when you take it as a stimulus to take immediate and positive action, which might involve merely running from the threat. It's also not a new idea that any activity reduces anxiety, though it's usually stated that this is because of A, the distraction from the feelings of anxiety, and B, the release of endorphins. And both those statements are true. But it might also be because the pattern of physical activity is recognized by the reptilian complex, and therefore the organism, in this case human, is responding to the threat. Now, since this paper is centered on the idea the reptilian complex underpins all response to the immediate environment, it's assumed that depression will be no exception. And the reason might well be astonishingly simple. I'm going to say that again because I need you to let it soak in a bit. Since this paper is centered on the idea that the reptilian complex underpins all response to the immediate environment, it's assumed that depression will be no exception. And the reason might be astonishingly simple. When anxiety has failed to resolve the threat, depression produces the opposite effect, a cessation of action. This might be that because anxiety-induced action didn't resolve the threat, anxiety ceased in order to reserve remaining resource. Doing nothing uses less resource than doing something, and so survival will last for longer. Of course, death could result in many circumstances, but the reptilian complex doesn't employ logic or what will happen if concepts, but it simply responds with immediacy to the patterns encountered by the moment. And the charge for that reptilian complex is to keep the organism alive as long as possible. So, okay, food's run out, you become depressed, you'll stop. You'll live for longer. It won't be much fun, but the reptilian complex doesn't care about that. It's about keeping the animal, the organism, surviving for as long as possible. Now, as stated earlier, this paper is based on the premise that the true purpose of life is survival, just as it has been for all animal life for the best part of 575 million years. There was almost certainly no emotional response attached, other than the reaction to threats to survival, and even that may have been purely instinctive. The human animal, though, places an emotional value on much of the elements of life, and the higher the value placed, the more important it appears to be as far as the reptilian complex is concerned. So as a result, the true purpose of life usually gets diverted onto things or individuals we feel we cannot live without, when the truth of it is that we do not want to live without them. Intellect and emotion ensure that many things might become a major life focus, and when that focus is removed for whatever reason, the reptilian complex views it as a threat to life, and so depression is the result. Stop moving, conserve resources to stay alive for as long as possible, thus fulfilling the true underlying purpose of life, survive for as long as possible. Now, as far as therapy to resolve this and other issues covered in this paper is concerned, BWRT already employs the concepts presented here. Trigger the anxiety-inducing concept, enhance the discomfort to the maximum that can be tolerated, induce a mild trauma to focus the event on the moment for the reptilian complex, introduce the freeze to induce the reptilian complex to search for a response, immediately introduce a preferred psychological process, confirm it repeatedly with urgency to stress importance, link it to a future to confirm that the anxiety was transient. That's a new view on the forward future pacing. We link it to a fantastic future memory to confirm that the anxiety was transient. Now, when this is completed successfully, there's a strong implication that whatever the cause of the presenting problem, it was transient, and therefore the true subconscious purpose of life remains intact. There might be some traction for therapy and exploring the notion of wanting to be alive as opposed to wanting to live, the concept of which is the subject of research and experiment, but I'm not discussing it just now. I'm having a look at that later on. So more thought is needed to explore how to use this material effectively with complex and or profound or repeated trauma. And it's possible there might be a way to reset the reptilian complex to focus again on the true purpose of life, survival. And in my opinion, it's likely to be possible, and maybe other minds will happen upon an idea or two. That's the end of the paper.